The past is all around us. Its messages, concealed by earth and forest, lie waiting to be discovered. Countless explorers, scholars and adventurers have journeyed in search of the clues that lie buried beneath our feet. Now, with the help of science, archaeologists are piecing together these fragments of our past and unlocking some of our oldest mysteries. Nearly 2 centuries ago, when archaeology was in its infancy, legend and myth formed part of our picture of the ancient past. Ageless stories, some handed down from a time before written records, told of heroes and villains, gods and monsters, mysteries and marvels. But how much of what these stories told was true? Were the legends that shaped our view of prehistory fact or merely fiction? Explorers and historians began to turn to the clues that lay buried in the ground. They started to dig for the truth. Their search became the story of archaeology. The quest began in Egypt, the enchanted land where nearly 200 years ago archaeology was born. Napoleon's victory over the Ottoman Empire had opened up Egypt to Europeans for the first time in centuries. Travelers flocked to explore the wonders preserved in the baking desert sands and to find for themselves the relics of this mighty past. Encouraged by their success, they dug and dug. But too often they were distracted by the splendor of what they found. Understanding the Egyptian past came a poor second to collecting artifacts. Many long-held assumptions about Egyptian history went unchallenged. Now, more than a century and a half later, science is casting new light on some of those long-held beliefs. When the Greek writer Herodotus visited Egypt in the 5th century BC, he was told how armies of slaves had labored for 20 years to build the Great Pyramid at Giza. He recorded what he heard, and in the absence of any other explanation, 19th and 20th century archaeologists accepted his account as fact. Archaeologist Dr. Zawi Hawass leads a team of scientists currently working on perhaps the most iconic symbols of ancient Egypt, the pyramids. He has been grappling with one of the great unanswered questions: how these massive structures were built. In the 1980s, during routine construction work at Giza, a mechanical digger struck a stone. The stone turned out to be part of an ancient wall.
This is a very important wall called the Wall of the Crow, and it is the oldest limestone wall ever built. It's about 10 meters high, 30 feet high, and the length of it is about 600 feet.
discovery of the Crow Wall, as it became known, provoked a new question. Why had it been built so close to the Giza Pyramid? The answer brought Dr. Hawass the evidence he had dreamt of. For the wall turned out to be part of a site that had once housed those very people who, more than 4,000 years ago, had built the pyramid at Giza. But for Zahi Hawass, more crucial than the ruined city was his discovery of the tombs where the pyramid builders had been laid to rest. These were not the treasure-filled tombs of royalty, but they promised something just as precious. Undisturbed, they still held within them rare and vital clues to the lives of these long-dead Egyptians.
For the first time, an evidence of the people who actually built the pyramids.
Within the tombs, the finds exceeded all expectations. There was pottery from the time of the 4th and 5th dynasty, 4,500 years old. Statues brought the pyramid builders vividly to life. But the picture emerging from within the tombs wasn't tallying with the accepted account of a workforce of captive slave laborers. As the excavation continued, Dr. Hawass discovered a series of well-preserved wall inscriptions.
The inscriptions here, every word here, can tell us about names of the people, what they do, and even sometimes they really show to us for the first time what kind of work they did.
The hieroglyphs describe the working lives of the pyramid builders. They tell of a comfortable, relatively prosperous domestic life, tending animals, brewing beer, and making bread. Dr. Hawass suspected that the pyramid builders were not the poor, browbeaten slaves of legend, but skilled artisans, professionals, and craftsmen. More evidence was to come, but from an unexpected quarter. Skeletons from the tombs were sent for routine scientific analysis. One skull revealed that a brain tumor had been surgically removed and that the patient had survived a further 2 years. And when there were accidents on the site, broken bones had been carefully set, damaged limbs surgically amputated. Medical treatment of this kind had only previously been seen in the skeletons of royalty and nobility. The health of these workers was clearly well looked after, with a level of care that would not have been lavished on slaves. The bones had yet another secret to reveal. From fragments of 4,000-year-old bone, scientists were able to extract samples of DNA. As more skeletons were found, the samples were compared. By piecing together the DNA evidence, the team were able to show that the pyramid builders were related to each other. Living in family groups, mothers, fathers, and children and cousins were all working together on the project. For Hawass, all the new evidence added up to one conclusion.
The pyramid was a national project of the whole nation. Every family in the south and the north used to participate in this building a pyramid by sending workforce to help the king.
The revelation that the pyramids were built not by slaves but by groups of committed artisan families challenged one of the most ancient stories about the building of the pyramids. and another of the long-accepted legends was about to crumble. Herodotus had described the pyramid builders maneuvering the 3 million stone blocks into place, and he'd put the number of workers needed as 100,000. But excavations at the Giza site revealed that the city had only housed a maximum of 20,000 people. So how could so few people have performed such an incredible feat? The answer lay not in Egyptian archaeology, but in science, and the inspiration of a civil engineer from Cambridge University in England. Dr. Dick Parry has always been fascinated by the construction of the pyramids.
You can't help but stand in the shadow of the pyramids and think, how did they construct these things?
For Parry, the traditionally accepted ideas about pyramid building simply didn't add up. In particular, no one had been able to explain to him how gigantic blocks of stone had been raised to the top of what were, for 43 centuries, the tallest structures on Earth. Remnants of sloping ramps have been found at the sites. Could sleds have been used to haul the stones up these ramps? But sleds would only work on very gentle slopes, which would mean very long ramps. A steeper gradient would be more efficient, but the angle would seem to rule out sleds. So, how was it done? A clue was to come from ancient relics hidden away in a long-forgotten cabinet in the Cairo Museum. Found near pyramid sites, these are 4,000-year-old miniature replicas of workmen's tools. There are sextants for measuring blocks, hammers for chiseling stone. But this model had the experts baffled. No one could work out what it was for.
It was quite apparent to me that they were quarter circles. And if you take 4 quarter circles and put it around stone, then you have a cylinder.
Parry designed scale models to test how sleds and cradles would perform, pulling stones up steep slopes.
I think even the most ardent sled fans would have to agree that it's unrealistic to try and pull a sled up a slope much steeper than 1 in 10. Whereas if you are rolling a heavy object, you can roll it up a ramp of, say, 1 in 4.
The device effectively transformed the load itself into a wheel. It was an ingenious solution, but would it have worked in practice? In this reconstruction, stone blocks and ramps were used to simulate the tasks. Sleds were not a success. But using giant wooden replicas of the cradle, Parry and a Japanese crew managed to roll a 2.5-ton piece of concrete up a 1 in 4 slope 15 meters long in less than a minute. Using the circular cradles, the stones could have been raised by fewer people and the work would have been done much faster. A city of 20,000 workers would have been more than enough to build the Great Pyramid at Giza. Archaeologists are adjusting their images of ancient Egypt and discover that time-honored sources may not always be as reliable as they seemed. But elsewhere, ancient accounts proved a more useful tool. As interest in the ancient past grew, early archaeologists turned their attention to another of the world's great civilizations, Greece. The Greek civilization yielded one of the richest bodies of literature in the world. Homer, Plato, and Plutarch wrote not only of their own times, but of events reaching back almost 2 millennia. The Greek stories told of kingdoms and quests, heroes and villains, fantastical tales where gods came to earth and mortals defied nature. The author Homer, in his famous Odyssey, writes of an island ruler, Minos, who rules over a prosperous Mediterranean kingdom. But the king's palace held more than royal riches. It housed a monster, the Minotaur. Half man, half bull, the Minotaur lived in a subterranean labyrinth. And each year King Minos was said to make a offering to the beast, a human sacrifice. The story intrigued a young English museum curator called Arthur Evans. He believed that Greek legends were rooted in history, and that somewhere King Minos, his palace, and perhaps even his Minotaur had really existed. But by the end of the 19th century, other scholars had become disillusioned with the ancient stories. Myth, they concluded, should not lead science, and Homer should not guide archaeology. Evans did not share their skepticism. He had been inspired by ancient seals coming from the island of Crete. They were carved on semi-precious stones and bore inscriptions that were both unique and perplexing. Evans bought some land at Knossos, a part of Crete known to be of archaeological interest. In 1900 he started to dig, looking for the source of those enigmatic seals. Almost at once he found buildings, walls and artifacts. Soon a whole complex had begun to emerge. Evans had made an astonishing discovery, one that placed him forefront of archaeology. He had found an ancient city, and he was convinced that it was the home of Homer's fabled King Minos. Part of the complex was clearly a palace, and within it Evans made another find, a throne room. To Evans, this was the final proof, the throne of King Minos himself. There was so much on the site to take in. The ruins were revelatory. They didn't fit with anything previously discovered. Everything about them was distinctive. Evans had discovered a new culture, one with complex and well-developed arts and science. These were prosperous, elegant, confident people. There was much to support Evans' view that Knossos was straight out of Homer. The rooms, corridors and halls of the palace merge with storage areas and meander confusingly. Following the passageways and stairwells, it's easy to see how the palace complex could have been portrayed as a labyrinth. And everywhere there were images of bulls dominating the site. But most extraordinary of all were the frescoes that seemed bizarre and unique, bull leaping. The legend of the Minotaur have been rooted in stories of young Cretan bull leapers. Evans felt that his faith in legend had been vindicated. He named his newly discovered civilization the Minoan, after the legendary King Minos. The realization that the Minoans had been more than myth was soon to lead to new questions and even more extraordinary answers. For at the heart of Knossos lay a mystery. The site seemed to have been occupied for about 500 years and then, inexplicably, abandoned. At the University of Reading, England, archaeologist Sturt Manning is using scientific techniques to get to the bottom of what happened on the island of Crete more than 3,000 years ago.
What exactly the demise of the Minoans is always a difficult question. For about 20, even 30 years, there's been a split between people thinking about a long, therefore somewhat slow process and a short, quick one.
Sturt's research builds upon an earlier theory about the fate of the Minoans. In the 1960s, a Greek archaeologist, Spiros Marinatos, linked their demise to an event on the Mediterranean island of Santorini, only 70 miles from their home on Crete. Around the time that the Minoans disappeared, Santorini had suffered a catastrophic volcanic eruption. In his search for evidence, Marinatos began to dig on Santorini. What he uncovered was as startling as the earlier excavations at Knossos. Buried beneath the earth lay a complete town. Frescoes, pots and artifacts all bore the unmistakable hallmark of Evan's mysterious Minoan civilization. Whoever the Minoans had been, they had not been confined to Crete. The town, almost perfectly preserved under a deluge of volcanic ash and pumice, bore witness to its sudden end. It was tempting to assume that such a huge eruption only 70 miles away from Crete must have spelled instant death for the Minoan civilization there too. But to establish this, accurate dating of the key events was essential. Ceramic dating of pottery from the site had put the eruption on Santorini at about 1500 BC, which corresponded to the collapse of the Minoans. But Sturt Manning is looking at more precise ways to date that eruption. He began using the science of dendrochronology, the study of tree rings, to give him a clearer picture.
Well, the special thing about trees is that they give you an absolute date. So you can look at a ring and say, this ring grew in a certain year, because each year of growth equals one ring. And you can divide that down early or late of a ring, so you can say this is the spring, this is the summer. So no other form of dating available to archaeologists or scientists really gives you that type of absolute precision.
In the life of a tree, a volcanic eruption is a significant event. A massive explosion like the one at Santorini releases growth-promoting materials into the atmosphere. Sturt began looking at ancient tree samples from the area and found that each did indeed show a marked growth spurt. And they showed them not around 1500 BC, but nearer to 1640 BC.
It's about 100 to 150 years earlier than the conventional wisdom placed it. It was traditionally placed around 1500 BC.
The tree ring evidence told Sturt that the volcano erupted at least a century before the Minoans vanished. They had survived the eruption, only to disappear more than 100 years later. To find out more, Sturt and his team are pushing the techniques of dendrochronology a step further, using chemical analysis. A volcanic eruption releases a variety of chemicals into the atmosphere. Trees absorb these chemicals into their wood, forming a unique record of changes in the surrounding air. In the analysis, tree samples are first acidified into gas. Post-eruption, the gases reveal an unpleasant picture. Toxic heavy metals and minerals from the volcano poison the air. Deposits of tephra, microscopic shards of glass, would have blanketed the islands. For the Minoans, the eruption with its fallout of ash and tephra, its blackened skies and tidal waves, must have seemed like the end of the world. Somehow they survived that initial trauma, only to begin a doomed battle against its long-term effects. the Minoans' prosperity would have collapsed into a struggle for basic survival against the cumulative effects of volcanic pollution. In the end, it was a struggle they lost. The Minoans vanished from Crete and from history. They lived on only in the words of Homer, until Arthur Evans brought their buried city into the light once more. A century ago, Arthur Evans was going against the tide of archaeological opinion when he looked for truth in ancient myth. By the 1960s, the climate of scholarly thought was even more entrenched. Among the rolling hills of southwest England, one man took on the archaeological establishment in a long-running search for the truth behind England's most enduring romantic legend. At its heart was the question, was this prehistoric mound near the Somerset village of Cadbury the site of Camelot, legendary home of King Arthur? According to legend, Arthur was a charismatic leader who unified Britain, drove out invaders, and brought new standards of peace and prosperity to the Dark Ages. The stories told of noble knights gathered around the famous Round Table. But was Arthur real, or just a story? And had Camelot ever existed? A medieval Welsh writer, Geoffrey of Monmouth, certainly mentions a leader called Arthur in his texts. But perhaps because of its often mystical flavor, archaeologists had dismissed the story of Arthur and Camelot as a fable. But one archaeologist refused to ignore the Arthur legend. He was intrigued by the mound at Cadbury. It was known to be an Iron Age hill fort. Local stories described it as the site of Arthur's Camelot. In 1966, British archaeologist Leslie Alcock began an excavation at Cadbury. What he found was that people had indeed been living at Cadbury for thousands of years. But much more recently, about 500 AD, the mound had been refortified into an extensive Dark Ages stronghold. The dates fitted with those estimated for King Arthur's reign. Alcock had found an important Dark Ages site, but could it have been Camelot? Significant support came in the form of foundations for a large meeting place, a grand hall fit for a Dark Ages king. Then came a decisive find: pottery fragments from thousands of miles away, oil jars from Tunisia, dishes from Carthage, wine jars from Byzantium. Such exotic pottery was almost unique in Dark Ages Britain. Its presence meant that someone at this site had unusual wealth and power. Alcock had shown that local stories had been right about Cadbury being a Dark Ages stronghold, although no one could be sure that it was Arthur who had ruled there. Alcock's pioneering work inspired another archaeologist, Richard Tabor.
When I was 10, I used to come up here and bother the archaeologists who started digging here in 1966. And eventually I bothered them so much that they asked me if I'd come up and take part, which I did. And on and off I've been doing that ever since.
With Alcock, Richard became fascinated with the mysteries of Cadbury. Alcock's finds indicated that the Cadbury site extended further than the mound itself. For Richard Tabor, this was significant. Was the hill fort more than a military stronghold? Perhaps it was the center of a much larger settlement. Richard is finding out by surveying the area around Alcock's site.
Yeah, that one back as well. The site,
he uses test pits to locate structures beneath the soil. And with the latest geophysical technology, he can identify which will be the most fruitful places to dig. So far, he has identified a settlement area of nearly 300 acres around Alcock's initial site and compiled this data on a computer.
We're eventually building up a picture of how the landscape would have looked at different times, the way in which it's been divided up by ditches, walls. We can get some idea of what the economy was like at a given time. If we look out into the wider landscape, we can see actually they had very considerable variation in resources. If we look down there now, we can see water in the valley. And then you've got the valley sides that would have been good for cultivation. Some of them are south-facing, and you'd have had good crop growth there.
Richard Tabor's survey reveals a complex, settled area with elaborate systems for agriculture, dwellings, and trade. Cadbury was clearly the center of a well-organized, thriving community, exactly the sort of achievement credited to King Arthur, and just what the Arthurian stories described as the backdrop to Camelot. The Arthurian legend of a successful kingdom led by a strong king seems to have some basis after all. But Cadbury was not the only place linked to the Arthur legend. Tintagel, only 100 or so miles from Cadbury. It features in the writings of Geoffrey of Monmouth as the birthplace of King Arthur. It's a wild and remote outpost on the southwest coast of England, an awe-inspiring spot steeped in mystery and romance. But the ruin we see today was built in medieval times, and archaeologists believe that a small Celtic monastery was the only other thing ever to have stood there. It wasn't until a chance event in the early 1980s that the truth about Tintagel began to emerge. A summer fire burned away several layers of grass and soil from the headland. The accident revealed something quite unexpected: the foundations of dozens of buildings. The find came as a shock to local archaeologist Carl Thorpe.
It's been found that just the concentration of buildings here is so dense, we're talking about nearly 200 buildings, that this couldn't have been a monastery, it must have been something much more significant.
Clues soon began to emerge. Buried near a drain was an inscribed slate that dated the site. It's one of the very few examples of Dark Ages inscription ever found, and it confirms that this major settlement had been built in Arthurian times. The finds at Tintagel didn't stop there. Emerging from the foundations was some intriguing pottery.
The significance of the pottery is that it shows that someone here at Tintagel was trading directly with the Byzantine Empire. Someone in Turkey or in Constantinople must have known about the significance of this place.
When Carl began to look closely at the pieces, his analysis revealed that the pottery had all been imported from the Mediterranean, and it was exactly the same type as that found at Cadbury Hill Fort. Clearly, Tintagel was linked to Cadbury and not as a minor outpost. As excavations continued, the true extent of the settlement became apparent.
Tintagel, if you put it all together, is probably the largest Dark Age citadel in the whole of Britain, which must have been governed by a royal person of the period.
So was there really a King Arthur? The question may never be fully answered, but the discoveries at Cadbury and Tintagel paint a new and more complex picture of that time. We now know that large-scale settlements did exist, supported by organized communities, economic systems, and foreign trade links. All of this increases the probability that there was also a powerful ruler. Leslie Alcock's faith in the value of the Arthur myth led ultimately to new revelations about the past. Yet despite its unorthodox inspiration, his research relied on data gleaned from physical evidence, solid objects revealed by patient digging. But some archaeologists are looking for other ways to explain the past. Physical evidence can show what actually existed, but can science show us how our ancestors experienced their world? Rising majestically from the green vastness of Salisbury Plain, England, Stonehenge is one of the most enigmatic monuments in the world. An ancient Neolithic stone circle, it seems to generate myth and legend, as well as speculation. It has at various times been explained as a giant astronomical computer, a beacon for extraterrestrial communication, and even a huge sundial. But perhaps the most well-established belief is that Stonehenge was built by Druids. With their animistic beliefs, colorful rituals, and ceremonies of human sacrifice, Druids provided a popular image for the site. But modern dating techniques show that Stonehenge was built more than 1,000 years before Celtic Druids ever came to England. So this idea, though attractive to many, is ruled out. So what then is Stonehenge about? The problem for interpreters of Stonehenge is that there is very little conventional evidence for archaeologists to get hold of. A few animal horns have allowed experts to carbon date the site, but otherwise its past has stayed shrouded in mystery. For Dr. Aaron Watson, traditional archaeology didn't seem to be offering an explanation for Stonehenge. He began to think outside the idea that all ancient sites must have had a practical use. Perhaps they had a different purpose.
For quite a long period in its history, archaeology has seemed to be primarily about describing the past. More recently, there's been a move away from this, because if we just try and describe them, we end up with a very dry, static, two-dimensional prehistory.
Aaron's idea was to view the ancient world as its occupants would have experienced it, looking for clues of form, feel, and sound. To understand Stonehenge's place in the world of the Neolithic, Aaron decided to begin with earlier sites. It was the beginning of a quest that was to take him all over Britain. He began his journey at Carned Mabon Wales, where dramatic outcrops have been used by humans since thousands of years before Stonehenge was built. In the simple, nature-dominated lives of the Neolithic people, these dramatic landmarks must have been significant.
It's outside the everyday pattern of life. It's somehow remote, it's high, these hills are often covered with cloud, it's colder, it's windier, it's generally more inhospitable. And it's quite likely that places like this would have been invested with some kind of significance to those people, maybe some kind of supernatural importance.
In this world, long before churches or public buildings, caves acted as temples and burial chambers. Rocky outcrops served as columns and portals. It was as though these ancient people were seeking out natural places that served their spiritual needs. As Aaron moved on to later sites, he noticed that, as time went on, Stone Age Britons were improving on nature, moving rocks and laying stones to create simple but stunning structures.
People stopped just having significance in the natural world, or what we understand as being the natural world, and instead began to build monuments of their own.
When Aaron started looking at the later Neolithic sites, the difference was even more marked. Construction was more extensive, although still integrated with the natural surroundings. Here at West Kennet, Wiltshire, a Neolithic long barrow or chamber is built into the hillside. The long barrows marked a major change in the relationship between people and landscape. They were made deliberately, not as dwellings, but as a stage for ritual. But West Kennet was to prove pivotal to Aaron Watson in quite another way. While he was examining the structure, he realized it had a significant property. It echoed.
The most obvious thing when you walk in here is how it changes the voice. You feel kind of enclosed by the stone, but the voice booms and echoes. So as you move into this mound from the outside world into the chambers, your experiences change, the sounds change. You've gone into a different place altogether.
The long barrow would have had an effect, much like that of entering a major place of worship today, an awe-inducing change in sound perception. Aaron began to think that these ancient sites might have been molded specifically to create effects with sound, to intensify mystical experience. He set out to test his theory with equipment that released a constant sound against which environmental changes in pitch and volume could be measured. His test subject was Stonehenge. Built 500 years after West Kennet, it's an astonishing achievement. A massive structure that must have seemed nothing short of stupendous to its Neolithic builders. Aaron suspected that its function was not practical, but dramatic, and that although there was no roof, the huge stone circle itself would have created a unique sound experience. To measure how the stones reflect sound, Aaron Watson uses a loudspeaker that emits sound at a range of pitches. Microphones are scattered around the site to register the sound after it has bounced off the stones. The results were recorded in a database and later plotted on a map of the structure. There was no doubt that the massive stones did affect the perception of sound. A computerized sound map of Stonehenge shows just how sound is distorted by the heavy stone circle. It shows that instead of decreasing in volume as it travels from the center, sound actually becomes louder as it moves outwards. The stones around the edge reflect sound inwards and amplify it.
People inside Stonehenge were being subjected to sounds that they could not have experienced anywhere else. And that must surely have created a great impression upon those people, added to the importance of the site, and maybe increased its mythological status.
The tests have confirmed Aaron's theory that Stonehenge could well have been an effective dramatic stage for ritual, perhaps the culmination of a trend running through the course of British Neolithic history. For Aaron Watson, understanding pre-literate societies demands innovation in ideas as well as in methods. Challenging established approaches is part of the progression of archaeology, but sometimes ideas come full circle. The Temple of Apollo at Delphi lay at the heart of a legendary Greek world of heroes, gods, and goddesses. In the epic writings of Homer and Plutarch, Delphi was the center of the world. For this was no ordinary temple. This was an oracle linked directly to the gods. Here, ordinary mortals could ask for a special favor, a glimpse into the future. The remains of a Greek temple still stand at Delphi. But is there any factual basis for the wealth of story and legend that surrounds the oracle? Almost all the Greek writers wrote about Delphi. They described it as a holy site to which thousands of pilgrims from the lowest to the highest in the land came seeking prophecies. Each was allowed to ask the oracle one question. The responses came from a priestess who had entered a trance by breathing supernatural fumes. The fumes, rising from the ground, possessed the priestess, or Pythia, with the spirit of the god Apollo. It was this infusion that gave the prophecies their accuracy. The Pythia was, literally, inspired. While it was clear that the Delphi temple really existed, 20th century archaeologists found the story of the prophesying priestesses and the entrancing fumes hard to take seriously. The days of relying on ancient Greek legend were deemed to be over.
The columns, the roofs, the internal walls, the internal...
John Hale, an archaeologist specializing in the history of the ancient Greeks, began his work on Delphi with just such a view.
I was taught extreme skepticism was the proper stance and that all ancient sources were to be disbelieved until proven absolutely worthy of trust based on a battery of modern tests.
With his colleague Henry Spiller, John is using all the tools at his disposal to understand what really took place on this ancient site.
So here is the inner sanctum of the Temple of Apollo, the seat of the oracle. And as a visitor, you would have come in and taken your place on a bench along that right-hand side, waiting for the priest to call you forward. You would then stand, put your question to the oracle, and she, seated in a crypt, a small enclosed space on that south side of the sunken area, would then respond.
As she comes into this very dramatic chamber, and then her whole religious belief system, preparing her to be possessed by the god.
John carefully analyzed all the stories about the oracle. He read accounts of the Pythia's trance and how her inspiration, fumes from the god Apollo, came from a fissure beneath her feet. Yet the idea that gases could really have been sending the Pythia into trances had already been dismissed.
The traditional view, we can't really call it a legend because it was presented as science and as fact by these writers who included eyewitnesses, that view is a fraud or a mistake.
At the end of the 19th century, a French archaeological team had excavated the site. Finding no evidence for a crack in the earth beneath the inner temple, they had dismissed the Greek stories as myth. But John was not convinced.
And I just can't help thinking, since they believed that the prophecies could only happen here, she couldn't prophesy somewhere else. It was the place that had the magical, religious, spiritual properties. There must have been something about the spot itself that made it all possible.
But pinning down just what it was about the Delphi temple that had made the oracle so special proved to be a challenge. In the end, it was a chance encounter with an American geologist that gave John his breakthrough. Jelle de Boer had been surveying Delphi for the Greek Geological Service. He had already plotted a geological fault across the site, a line that ran right underneath the ancient temple. De Boer had no idea of the significance of his new line on the map. In fact, he assumed that everyone knew the fault was there.
I had trouble convincing him that he'd made an important discovery because he thought it was so obvious. And it was hard for me to say, or to make him believe, that he had really observed something that would turn 100 years' worth of archaeological wisdom on its head.
John Hale and Jelle de Boer returned to Delphi to resurvey the fault in detail.
When we arrived at Delphi, what surprised me was exactly what Jelle said would surprise me, how obvious it was It didn't need a degree in geology to recognize that there were these exposed fault faces that were different from the rest of the mountainside.
And as the pair cast their net wider, it began to look as if there might be a second fault. De Boer's fault line was indeed obvious once it was pointed out.
So here at last was hard evidence that there had been more than one fault involved at the site of the Oracle of Delphi.
De Boer plotted the second fault. It crossed the first directly beneath the oracle, creating a stress point that would have caused cracks on the surface above to open and close over time. The fissure beneath the Pythia's seat was likely to have been reality 2,000 years ago. But what about the gases? De Boer turned his attention to travertine rock deposits around the site of the temple. They showed where springs had once flowed up from deep beneath the ground.
And when Jelle de Boer saw this, it was his idea that at the time when the spring was emerging at the top of this wall, it would have been bringing up along the fault line some of the gases that were involved in the prophetic procedure.
If gases were coming from the active Delphi fault below, they would have been dissolved in the spring water and deposited in the travertine rock.
Wanting some evidence to convince skeptics that there really had been an unusual flow of gas here in ancient times and that we could give evidence of what that gas might be, we were given permission by the Greek government to take samples with hammer and chisel from this massive travertine rock.
Back in the laboratory, the travertine rock was broken into pieces and then dissolved in acid to release the gases. Finally, the gases were extracted and tested. They turned out to be light hydrocarbons, vaporized by geological activity deep within the earth. One of the principal gases was ethylene. But would inhaling ethylene have had an effect on the Pythia? The team's expert was toxicologist Dr. Henry Spiller.
Lighter doses, it'd give you a lightheadedness, a sort of a disembodied euphoria. It's a rather pleasant sensation. You'd begin to get a mild numbness or tingling sensation, lack of inhibition. All of this would be taken, I'm sure, by someone who was prepared to be possessed by the god as knowledge that the god has arrived.
Dr. Spiller's account exactly mirrored ancient Greek descriptions of the Pythia's intoxicated behavior. John and his team had used science to prove that the words of the ancients can't be so easily dismissed. For John, it was a defining moment.
Delphi is one of the most important sites in Greece. The fact that so many ancient writers recorded this tradition has been part of the evidence for not taking ancient writers seriously. If they could be wrong about Delphi, well, they could be wrong about anything. So this would really have implications way beyond the interpretation of Delphi.
The team has shown how experts from different fields can work together to find a solution. And John Hale has demonstrated that an open mind can still be a scholar's best friend.
One thing that has changed for me is the way I approach ancient sources now, ancient writings. I have gone around now to the other side, and I feel that it's up to modern science to disprove these ancient sources, that as with the accused in a court trial, they should be believed until you can prove them wrong.
As archaeology has matured, science has developed more precise tools to find and interpret the material evidence that links us with the ancient past. There's much that may be forever beyond our reach. But as signposts and guides in the quest for understanding, legends have proved their worth. Without them, many truths would have been lost forever, beneath the endlessly shifting sands of history. The past is all around us. Its messages, concealed by earth and forest, lie waiting to be discovered. Countless explorers, scholars and adventurers have journeyed in search of the clues that lie buried beneath our feet. Now, with the help of science, archaeologists are piecing together these fragments of our past and unlocking some of our oldest mysteries. Asia, from towering mountains to burning deserts, a vast continent of stunning landscapes stretching from the eastern Mediterranean to China. Once remote and inaccessible to Europeans, the Orient was for centuries a land of mystery and romance. But despite the difficult terrain, travel was possible. From about 200 BC, a series of narrow paths wound their way for more than 6,000 perilous miles across Asia's sprawling mass. This was the legendary Silk Road, long held to be the first highway to connect the exotic cultures and fabled cities that lay along its route. Today, archaeologists are delving deeper into the history of that crucial link. They're solving some ancient mysteries about the Silk Road cities and revolutionizing our assumptions about the history of Asia. The Silk Road was not for the faint-hearted. Its travelers risked life and limb to cater for a very human desire, the urge to buy and sell. Rare and precious goods, from spices to seeds, from silver to salt, were carried across mountains and deserts to those who would pay. The traders were the links in a chain that could take a single piece of ivory or a bolt of silk many thousands of miles. And along with the goods went ideas, beliefs, and knowledge. This fragile path became a bridge between worlds. The Silk Road gets its name from one of the world's most prized fabrics. Demand for silk was the driving force that pushed a path across Asia, a path that was thought to have linked peoples and civilizations for the first time. Certainly the demand for silk had created a regular and profitable trade between East and West. For centuries, silk had been the exclusive possession of one nation, China. Its production was the most zealously guarded trade secret in history. Betrayal was punished by death. The finest of threads, yet stronger than steel, silk took the world by storm. Everyone who saw it wanted it, and traders took huge risks to deliver it. But around 221 BC, China's Emperor Qin, after whom China is named, found his prosperity threatened by the attacks of marauding tribes from the north. He protected his silk by building a wall. It was no ordinary wall. Nearly 3,000 miles long and more than 7 meters high, complete with watchtowers and fortresses, it was a staggering engineering achievement, one that in sheer scale has not been equaled since. With the Great Wall came peace for China and protection for the silk trade. By the time that Qin died, his kingdom had grown and prospered, so much so that his death was honored with the most lavish burial site ever seen. Qin's tomb lies in the midst of a miniaturized replica of his kingdom, built underground and guarded by an unusual army. 8,000 life-size terracotta warriors, every one different, stand poised for battle. Originally brightly painted, they make Qin's burial site one of the most extraordinary in the world. The expansion of the silk trade had repercussions all along its trading route. Within 300 years, a great city had grown up at the other end of the chain, more than 4,000 miles away. Tucked away in a remote part of Jordan, the ancient desert city of Petra is one of the world's most awe-inspiring sights. The city appears like a revelation at the end of a dark, narrow gorge, the Sikh. Even today, 2,000 years after its creation, the first sight of Petra is unforgettable. Petra is one of the glories of Arabia. Carved from the solid limestone rock, its immense columns and statues glow in the changing colors of the desert sun. But Petra is one of the Silk Road's biggest mysteries. What is this remarkable city doing in the middle of nowhere? How was its wealth supported? And who were the mysterious people who built it? Petra in Greek means rock, and that's a particularly appropriate name. For the city was a fortress ruled for 500 years by a powerful yet shadowy people, the Nabateans. The Nabateans created Petra at the beginning of the first millennium. It became a major stopover point on the Silk Road, effectively controlling the trade between Arabia and Egypt to the south and Iraq and Asia to the north and east. Camel trains carrying everything from gems and silk to bitumen and balsam all wound their way towards Petra. But why? The travelers had to pay tolls. That was what made Petra wealthy. So what were they getting in return? What was it that attracted traders to Petra. No one had an answer, and the Nabateans themselves were just as mysterious. Little was known about them or their origins. It's most likely that they were a nomadic Mesopotamian people who first settled in this area about 500 BC. But how did a group of wandering nomads become the wealthy and sophisticated society that built Petra? A team of archaeologists from Brown University in the United States is determined to solve the mystery of Petra. They've begun the task of uncovering the complex structures that crowd the site. Petra covers a huge area. Only a tiny proportion of the site has been excavated so far. But the Brown University team has been focusing on the Great Temple Complex, a spectacular array of terraces and colonnades. The Great Temple seems to have been the center for Nabatean life. It's the largest freestanding building in Petra, with an imposing entrance and a host of separate areas for public and private ceremonies. As the dig progressed, the team stumbled across a small, concealed opening beneath the temple. For Christian Cloak, what lay beyond it was the discovery of a lifetime. The opening was the entrance to a storeroom, but the treasure it contained was more precious than gold or silver or gems. It was water.
The cistern, I think, was very surprising when we first found it. We were expecting a smaller structure with a sort of light bulb shape, and what we got was a huge rectangular room that went on for 7.5 meters in one direction, 8 in the other, and turned out to be 6 meters deep. So, I mean, it was capable of storing vast amounts of water, and we just weren't expecting something like that right beneath the temple precinct itself.
This was clearly a major water store. But how did the water get into it, or out? Soon the team traced pipes leading to other underground cisterns. Their first discovery turned out to be just part of an ingenious water system engineered to capture, channel and store water from winter flash floods, the region's only rainfall and its most precious commodity.
I think one of the most remarkable things about Petra's water systems is just the level of sophistication and the efficiency with which they worked. I mean, they had only a few weeks of the year, probably at best, to collect rainwater, and had to not only prevent it from destroying the city in floods, but had to collect it and channel it to places where it could be stored.
It soon became clear that the Nabateans had created a complex hydraulic system, complete with ceramic pipelines, gravity feeds and reservoirs, reaching far out beyond the city itself. They had controlled the water of the entire region.
You have probably like 2 or 3 meters. This goes almost to the door over there.
But this underground desert water system was more than just clever, it was secret. Only the Nabateans knew where the cisterns were hidden, and only they had access to the water.
They didn't want to mess around with who could just tap into the water system and take whatever they wanted, because it's such a scarce resource. They needed to make sure that access to it was very controlled. So the storage and everywhere that the water was running was pretty well kept secret from anyone who didn't want to have access to it.
At last, the Nabatean secret had been revealed. Petra had provided the only reliable year-round water source in the region. Travelers were obliged to stop there to replenish their supplies, and the money they spent was plowed back into the city, making it an even bigger magnet for traders. For more than 500 years, the Nabateans honed the glories of Petra. Eventually, in about 550 AD, directions of trade began to change, the travelers began to dwindle, and Petra and the Nabateans slowly vanished into obscurity, taking with them a secret that remained buried for 1,500 years. More than 4,000 miles away in Southeast Asia, along the southern leg of the Silk Road, another mysterious civilization has been challenging the historians. Towering above the jungle canopy of Cambodia, this was the crowning achievement of the Khmer people, who lived here at Angkor Wat between 800 and 1400 AD. It is an awe-inspiring sight, a vast, stunningly engineered temple complex, the largest religious monument in the world. But at its heart lies an enigma. The civilization that created it seemed to have come out of nowhere. There are few traces of what came before, and few clues to the history of the Khmer people to whom we owe this remarkable place. Professor Charles Hyam has dedicated his professional life to answering the questions that hang over the Angkor civilization.
There is so much to find out about Southeast Asia, but the dominance of the civilization of Angkor over so many centuries is one of the things that attracts any archaeologist coming to Southeast Asia. The first visitors to this great city and temple of Angkor came in the 16th century, and ever since Western people have been wanting to know about its origins. How did it happen? Who was responsible for these enormous monuments? And therefore my interest was trying to find the origins of it way back in the prehistoric past.
One of the things that puzzles experts about this hauntingly magnificent complex is that although the Khmer people are unquestionably Southeast Asian, the temples at Angkor show clear signs of a completely different society. One 2,000 miles and a cultural world away, India. The very center of the temple, with its enormous sandstone towers, was built to represent Mount Meru, the home of the Hindu gods and a sacred site in India. And the Indian influence is equally clear in the detailed artwork that covers the site.
This is one of the best examples of the stimulus provided by Indian epic literature upon the people of Angkor. The local people of Angkor picked up all these fantastic stories taken from the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, these epic Indian literature, and they produced here this great relief that extends over tens of meters on each direction. And essentially this particular one depicts the churning of the ocean of milk, which was designed in order to generate from the oceans below the earth the elixir of immortality known as Amrita.
It isn't just Hinduism that seems to have been an influence at Angkor. The temple at nearby Angkor Thom is decorated with hundreds of sculpted heads. But these figures echo another Indian religion, Buddhism. These images of Khmer kings reflect a strong identification with the Indian prophet, Buddha.
Indian influence is something that's been dominant in trying to explain and understand this civilization. Looking around you at Angkor, you can't help but notice the extraordinary similarities that exist between the architecture, the religion, the language, the script. Everything seems to come from India. And yet, in fact, there is a very, very solid local overlay. So the Indian influence comes in by all means, but it's molded, it's adopted, it's used by the local people to their own advantage. And so therefore it's an interesting mixture that one is constantly trying to unravel. The veneer of Indian culture over a solid local base is the sort of model that we're now working on and looking at.
Clearly the Khmer people had been in contact with Indian ideas and religion over many years. But how had such a powerful influence reached them from such a distance? We know that the Silk Road was never just one highway, there were numerous routes, not all of them on land. At about the time Angkor Wat was built, the Chinese were trading silk with India along a southern sea route via Cambodia. They were using a sailing route that relied upon the monsoon winds to carry boats between India and Cambodia. Once in Cambodia, the Indian sailboats were marooned until the winds changed direction to blow them back to the subcontinent. The vagaries of the monsoon often kept the traders stranded for as long as 6 months at a time. So Cambodia became their second home, and Indian religion and culture began to take root in the region. Trade explained the Indian influence, but no one knew just when these contacts had begun. Did Indian traders arrive after the Angkor civilization was established, merely adding a veneer of Indian culture, or did they come far earlier, shaping and forming the entire Angkor civilization? Nobody knew. For Charles Hyam, it was a crucial question. He suspected that Indian trading was far older than we thought, reaching back before the time of Angkor Wat and the silk trade, and he began to look for proof. He was inspired by long-lost Chinese documents that had come to light early in the 20th century. They were detailed descriptions of a thriving Cambodian seaport and city called Funan. When it was visited by the Chinese in the 3rd century AD, Funan was said to be already trading with India and showing the marked influence of Indian culture and religion. The only problem was that Funan did not seem to exist. Scholars had found no signs of this culture, which would have predated Angkor Wat by more than 800 years. In the absence of any sign of the city itself, most scholars dismissed the Funan documents as a traveler's tale. But during the 1930s, a French geographer named Pierre Paris detected the outline of a man-made canal system in a coastal area of Cambodia called Angkor Borai. Follow-up work was interrupted by war, and it wasn't until 1995 that research at the site could begin. It was immediately clear that the canal system was well-planned and extensive, linking sea and the hinterland with an ancient settlement at Angkor Borai. At first, archaeologists had assumed that the canals were part of a rice irrigation system. But there was another possible explanation. Could these be the trading highways described by the Chinese nearly 2,000 years ago? Could Angkor Borai be the fabled lost city of Funan? Charles has come to Angkor Borai to meet Dr. Miriam Stark of the University of Hawaii, a colleague who has spent 8 years working on the site.
Hello, Charles. How are you?
See you again.
Nice to see you.
Sit you down. How's it going?
He has brought with him a translation of the original Chinese documents describing Funan to compare with what Dr. Stark's work has revealed at Angkor Borai.
Miriam, I brought the massive tome or tomes that you mentioned. Excellent. And here we have the description of Le Funan by Paul Pelliot's translation of the Chinese documents that was published precisely 100 years ago.
But he talked a lot about the moats and also about the wall that surrounded all of the kinds of capitals and all the Funan cities. And Angkor Borai here has still several remaining segments of the wall, especially here along its eastern side.
Yep. And is it your view that the city here would have been occupied in the 3rd century AD at the same time that the Chinese emissaries came down looking for an alternative maritime Silk Road?
Oh yes. What's interesting about Angkor Borai is that actually the occupation starts in the 4th century BC. So
Miriam's work has already established that there was indeed a significant settlement here at the time that the Funan descriptions were written. Now her attention has turned to the waterway complex.
Yeah.
So, how's it going with the canals? You've been working on them now for some time, haven't you?
We have, and the reason we have is because part of understanding this Funan is determining whether Funan really was a maritime trade-based empire that the historians think it was. If that's the case, then Angkor Barai could have been an inland capital that was sending goods down to the coast. So one way to try to test that is to look at these ancient canals and to figure out how old they are, and also whether they have the dimensions capable of carrying boats that would have been loaded with provisions heading to the south.
Surveying the huge and complicated Angkor Barai site is essential to the success of the research. Miriam has invited Charles to see for himself how this vital process is going. Today they're heading for an outlying area, accessible only by boat. It's a chance for Charles to see the canals at first hand.
We'll probably go down this excavated canal, correct, Angkor, and then drop down this way, drop south.
And that's this way, is it over here?
That's right.
Okay.
This is a new site, and to the untutored eye, it's just a field. But this is where years of training pay off. For archaeologists, the tiniest signs indicate what's hidden beneath the soil. A series of careful measurements confirm their first impressions.
This is very exciting for me, not having been here before.
Corner of the mud.
Vertical angle is -1.5 degrees and horizontal angle is 342 degrees and 10 minutes.
Okay. When we got to this site 3 days ago, we saw that actually there's a complex of 4 separate mounds, each of which is surrounded by a moat. And in the center of 3 of the mounds, we also found remains of collapsed brick structures. Based on those brick structures, most of which were looted, and the recovery of ceramics, we think that the site could date between around AD 300 and 800.
Again, the dates fit with the Chinese accounts of Funan. At another Angkor Barai site, where excavation is already advanced, the team have found some crucial new evidence that Charles is keen to see.
And we were invited by the district to excavate a unit here. When we did that, we encountered an area here of fill which seems older, perhaps older than AD 500. And directly underneath there, we found a cemetery. The cemetery is obvious in this section because you can see bones sticking out of the section here and also here. We found several kinds of pottery throughout this whole sequence at the top. We had some fragments of kendi, yes.
The kendi pottery is significant. It comes from Sri Lanka and is evidence of a long-distance sea trade.
The appearance corresponds with the appearance of Buddhism or some Indic religion in Southeast Asia.
So this came on the heels of trade, basically?
Everywhere that we see this along the coast of the South China Sea, we think that we've got evidence of interaction with South Asia.
Yep. And so what about jewelry? Did you find any jewelry?
We did find some. Not so many stone beads, but we did find glass beads like these.
Yes. Yes, these are almost identical with the ones that we find way up in northeast Thailand.
Some technical studies that we've done recently suggest that the beads themselves may have been made in the Mekong Delta, but the remaining question is whether the glass was made in the Mekong Delta or whether cullet was brought in from South Asia, perhaps as ballast.
Yes, it seems to me that either way you've got definite Indian influence coming in with glass.
Here was the evidence that trade goods from India were commonplace at Angkor Barai at just the time reported for Funan. And the canals at Barai that so closely resemble those described for Funan? Miriam has been working on dating them too.
Have you managed to date the canals yet?
Well, we haven't dated this canal segment, but we have dated a short canal segment that runs from Angkor Barai down to Phnom Barai. And we found that its initial construction was around 2,000 years ago, and about 1,500 years ago it seems to have filled up and people no longer used it.
That's perfect dating for Funan, isn't it?
It is.
The research has shown that Angkor Barai had been a thriving center, trading with India and beyond even before the 3rd century AD. It's now almost certain that this was indeed the lost city of Funan, and that this culture formed the foundation of the rich and complex Angkor civilization that followed. For Charles Hyam, the importance of the trade links can't be overemphasized.
The control of trade was absolutely vital, and this is probably why the earliest civilizations in Southeast Asia developed in coastal areas which were exposed to the initial arrival of the trade vessels and indeed the dispatch of trade goods to India and to China. And this allowed local rulers, local chiefs, who were already emerging and becoming more powerful and more wealthy, suddenly to enrich themselves and gather together more followers and become more wealthy. And then, of course, all sorts of other things followed. For example, cities, taxation, the development of state religions, the adoption of more and more godlike features for these rulers. And the end product of all this was a site like Angkor.
Historians are now absorbing the information that long-distance trade was occurring in this part of Asia about 1,000 years earlier than they had thought. For along with the trade would have gone ideas and influences, a cultural melding from which great civilizations could emerge. The findings at Angkor Barai have put the clock back on contacts between India and Southeast Asia. But will historians have to revise their views about trade elsewhere in Asia? Bridging east and west, Constantinople, the modern Istanbul, was and is a natural crossroads, an ancient city straddling the Bosphorus Straits that divide Europe from Asia. Perfectly positioned, Constantinople became the hub of all the great trading routes, creating a glorious melting pot of cultural diversity and commercial acumen. By the 10th century AD, intercontinental trade had laid a firm foundation for what was later to become the Ottoman Empire. As far as historians were concerned, the blossoming of Constantinople was the beginning of long-distance communication in this part of the world. But 500 miles from the capital, in the stark tundra of Turkey's Anatolian steppe, one of the world's oldest cities has something new to reveal. Çatalhöyük dates from the dawn of human civilization. It's the earliest city ever discovered, the first evidence of people living in a large, settled group. Here, 9,000 years ago, there were streets and houses with decorated walls and ornaments. A team from England's Cambridge University is slowly uncovering the city. For archaeologist Shahina Farid, this evidence of community living is a turning point in human history.
As a Neolithic site, the characteristics of Çatalhöyük is that it's one of the earliest sites when people settled down after a hunting-gathering type livelihood. And they settled down in one place, started building houses and taking advantage of their environment.
The city was supported by farming, and its people enjoyed a period of stability lasting many centuries. And they weren't just scraping a living. Skeletons buried beneath the houses revealed that these ancient city dwellers were well-nourished and healthy, apparently prosperous.
The community at Çatalhöyük appear to have done very well at this particular site. The site was populated and lived in for over 1,000 years, and if things hadn't been working for them, they would certainly have moved on. So something was obviously keeping them at this particular spot.
So what was the key to their success? How did they manage the transition from nomadic life at a time when other groups had failed? As they considered this question, archaeologists at the site began to discover something unusual. Hidden in walls and floors, they found caches of a remarkable substance. It was obsidian, a natural volcanic glass. The people of Çatal must have brought it from the now dormant volcanoes of the nearby Cappadocia mountain range. Extremely hard and sharp, obsidian was a precious commodity, a perfect material for making arrows, knives, and even mirrors. The hidden caches of obsidian contained more than anyone could require for their own use. It looked as if the Çatal people were dealing in obsidian. But who were they trading with? Dr. James Blackman works in a nuclear laboratory, but he is in fact an archaeologist with a special interest in obsidian.
Archaeologically, obsidian is important because it was extensively traded throughout the ancient Near East, and it can be used to trace exchange networks.
There are only a limited number of sources for obsidian in the world. The people of Çatal had access to one of them. Yet in the last few years, archaeologists have been finding early obsidian artifacts in the Yemen and Iran, where no natural source exists. So where did that obsidian come from?
I use chemistry of the material to trace the trade. The first thing you need to do is to have samples of obsidian. Once you've established the chemistry of the geological sources, you can then match the chemistry of the artifacts found in the various archaeological sites.
And this is where the nuclear reactor comes in. Samples from all over the Middle East come to this laboratory where Dr. Blackman prepares them for chemical analysis. The samples are treated and passed into the nuclear reactor to be irradiated. The irradiated obsidian then begins to give off radioactive gamma rays that can be recorded and analyzed to give a chemical fingerprint for each sample. All samples from a particular source will share the same fingerprint. These chemical signatures allow Dr. Blackman to compare foreign samples with obsidian from Turkey. The results showed that the artifacts from Yemen and Iran could only have come from Turkish volcanoes.
The central Anatolian Turkish sources have been found as far south as the Levant and along the Euphrates River, and as far east as central Iran at a site called Tepe Yahya in south-central Iran.
Around volcanoes close to Çatalhöyük, there's clear evidence that obsidian had been extracted and worked. It seems that the Çatal people were processing obsidian and sending it on the first leg of a lengthy trade route. Perhaps this control over a popular commodity had accounted for their prosperity. These were the very earliest human settlements, and already a trade network was reaching out beyond the immediate area. Historians had thought of the Silk Road as the earliest Asian trade route, but the Çatalhöyük evidence totally overturned that idea. For the obsidian traders were plying parts of the very same route 7,000 years earlier. It was a revelation, and there were more to come. Indus Valley, in modern-day Pakistan and northern India, lie the remains of the world's largest prehistoric civilization. More extensive than that of ancient Egypt, more sophisticated than anything that came before and much that came after, the Indus Valley cities reached their peak about 4,000 years ago, 5,000 years after Çatalhöyük was built. For the past 10 years, Dr. Mark Kinowa has been studying the Indus Valley site at Harappa. Excavations here have revealed a large, solidly built city. Its brick houses, complete with bathrooms and water systems, displaying technology not seen again until Rome 2,000 years later. This was a typical, prosperous, peaceful Indus Valley city, part of a pattern of closely linked settlements.
The only way to really understand how they were integrated is through looking at their technologies, because the technologies were key to the movement across the Indus Valley and also the integration of those cultures.
In his work at the site, Mark Kinowa has built up a picture of a skilled and sophisticated people. They used a standardized system of weights and measures, and a writing system, one of the first, to tally their goods. It all pointed to trade, yet the Harappans predated the supposed start of the Silk Road by 2,000 years. The key to Dr. Kinowa's latest research lies with these tiny stone beads. They are found throughout the Indus Valley, and similar ones have been found much further afield. Mark Kinowa began to work on ways of identifying the origin of the beads. For him, the key lay in the technology used to make them. In his laboratory in the US, he has built a replica of an ancient drill.
This technique that I'm using here is based on a technique developed in the Indus Valley civilization, so around 2600 BC. The technique that I'm using here is using water to try to help cool the bead as it's being drilled. This keeps it from cracking, and it also cools the drill itself because the drill it gets very hot. It also washes out the ground up bead material that you're drilling out of this bead. One of the distinguishing features of beads is their technology in which they're made. So by comparing technologies, we can determine that beads that look the same are actually made in different places. And this is the result of looking at their drill holes and looking at specific aspects of the techniques used to manufacture them.
Kinowa has learnt that drills are specific to certain areas, and that each type leaves a different set of minute marks on the bead, a kind of trademark identifying where the bead was made. But these tiny marks are on the inside of the bead, and so he fills the beads with a gel that takes a precise impression. The gel impressions provide a unique record of the hundreds of beads Kinowa has gathered from sites across the globe. And under a powerful microscope, Dr. Kinowa can determine precisely where each bead was made. And he's discovered that Harappan beads have been turning up in some very surprising places.
By comparing the inside of the bead, meaning the drill hole, and the measurements and all of the specifics of it, it's possible now to confirm that beads made in the Indus Valley were going to Mesopotamia, they were going to Central Asia, and most recently I'm finding that there might be beads in China. Finding beads from the Indus Valley in China during the Western Zhou period, probably around 1200 to 800 BC. This is Shang and Western Zhou. And it's very important. It means that there's much wider overlapping trade networks in the ancient period than anyone had ever imagined.
The Turkish obsidian findings had shown that there was trade across parts of Asia 9,000 years ago. But the Harappan bead evidence proves that by 4,000 years ago, there was trade right across Asia, 2,000 years before the Silk Road had begun. It looks as if the history books had it wrong, and that moreover trade contacts had been part and parcel of the growth of ancient civilizations. It's a breakthrough in our knowledge of Asian history, and to Mark Quinoa it makes perfect sense.
The emergence of early civilizations could not have occurred without trade. You cannot develop a complex society without connections to distant areas. Trade is key to bringing materials in from distant areas that are not accessible to everyone in a society. The emergence of hierarchical society, different classes of society, is based on some people getting certain materials and other people not getting it. So trade is essential for helping to create hierarchy and differences within a society.
Evidence was mounting to show that established trading links must have existed from earliest times. But many historians still held to the idea that only the goods had moved along the chain. The people and their cultures stayed separate. The next breakthrough was to come from a desolate area very near to where those tiny Harappan beads ended their journey, in Xinjiang province, China. This is the Taklamakan Desert in the westernmost part of China, a vast desert of sand and stone rimmed by impassable mountains. To the south are the slopes of the Himalayas and Tibet. To the north, the frozen wastes of Mongolia and the Gobi Desert. Taklamakan is hardly welcoming, frozen in winter and burning in summer. Yet cities such as Zhaohuo, Subashu and Lulan, now ruins in the sand, once bustled with life. For these were the staging posts in the Silk Road, stopovers where traders took refuge and exchanged their goods. When the silk traders crossed the Taklamakan, they linked the people and cultures of East and West for the first time, or so historians had thought. But on the edge of the Taklamakan, tucked away in a little visited Tarim Basin Museum, was a discovery that would change all of that. Mummies. Not the deliberately prepared mummies of Egyptian fame, but ancient corpses, naturally preserved by the dehydrating desert climate. Such mummies are not uncommon in desert areas, but these were so unexpected they sent shock waves through the archaeological world. Their features reflect not the Asian people who inhabit this continent today, but a completely different physical type. Some of these bodies are more than 6 feet tall, much taller than the norm for the local Chinese population. Their desiccated remains reveal wisps of blonde hair, high cheekbones, long prominent noses, and round, deep-set eyes. None of these is characteristic of Asian peoples. They are typically Caucasian. It looked as if these were visitors from outside, travelers who had died thousands of miles from their original home. The mummies provoked a whole raft of questions. Why were these people so different to today's Asian population? Who were they, and where had they come from? There was one clue. The mummies were dressed in colorful clothing, wrapped in cloth. Irene Good is a textiles expert from Harvard University. She was invited by the Chinese authorities to take fabric samples for analysis. In her laboratory, she carried out a meticulous examination. First, she looked at the designs, patterns, and weaving techniques, comparing them with those known to have been used throughout history by different cultures.
I was seeing design styles and motifs that were actually influences from areas that we think of as quite divergent and far away, namely these tartans or plaids that may have appeared to be what we are familiar with from Iron Age Europe, Northern Europe.
Then moved on to the fibers themselves. Advanced techniques enabled her to pin down the original source of the materials. She's hit by the fact that most of the cloth is wool.
There are a number of different diagnostic features of animal fibers that can be used to identify the animal from which it came, namely the diameter of the fiber, the shape of it in cross-section, the type of scale, the shape of the scale, and how it's arranged in the shaft of the fiber, and also the level of waviness or kinkiness to the fiber.
Under the powerful gaze of a scanning electron microscope, the shape and structure of each fiber becomes crystal clear. From this detailed picture, Irene can go on to identify the species of sheep that a fiber has come from. Analyzing her results, Irene soon realized that the wool of the mummy's clothes came from sheep that could not have been found in China at that time.
Culturally, China was not involved with wool production or use until considerably later. The wools that were used by the mummies in the Tarim Basin, some of them were related to sheep and therefore of people that had a common ancestor, at least to one that were used in Europe. So it's almost certainly coming in from the West.
If these were the mummies of visitors from the West, it was vitally important to know just when they had arrived. Could they really be as old as they seemed? In the laboratory, radiocarbon dating techniques were able to provide the answer. These people died about 4,000 years ago, almost 2,000 years before the Emperor Xin opened up the Silk Road. The presence of the mummies meant that there had been Western visitors in this remote part of China many centuries before we thought, proving that it wasn't only trade goods that had made the journey across Asia. And clearly the Silk Road traders were not breaking new ground, but following in the footsteps of their much earlier ancestors. The work at Petra and Angkor Wat showed how far-reaching and diverse the effects of trade can be. Now historians are accepting that very similar influences must have been stimulating cultures across Asia at least 4,000 years ago and possibly earlier. So the great civilizations of Asia had not grown up in isolation. The threads of trade had joined them from earliest times. Suddenly we're looking at an exchange of ideas, knowledge and culture that we never suspected. East and West may well have more of a common history than either have imagined. The past is all around us. Its messages, concealed by earth and forest, lie waiting to be discovered. Countless explorers, scholars, and adventurers have journeyed in search of the clues that lie buried beneath our feet. Now, with the help of science, archaeologists are piecing together these fragments of our past and unlocking some of our oldest mysteries. The Americas. They're known in the West as the New World. But these vast continents were the cradle of some of the world's oldest civilizations. Sophisticated cultures built thriving centers with all the apparent permanence of our cities today. Here, surrounded by fine architecture and skillful engineering, the arts and sciences flourished over many centuries. But it wasn't to last. Today, these sites are abandoned, their occupants long gone. Their ruins pose one of the biggest mysteries in archaeology. How and why did these great cities die? And what became of the people who lived in them? Perhaps the best known ancient American civilization was that of the Incas. From the beginning of the 15th century AD, their empire covered a vast area of South America, from Ecuador to Chile. When the Spanish invaders arrived in 1532, the Inca cities dominated this mountain kingdom. But the Spanish had come to conquer, and the Incas were no match for their military might. By the middle of the 16th century AD, the Inca Empire was crushed. Their cities were abandoned, their culture overwhelmed. As the Spanish busied themselves with building a new empire, the end of the Incas was reduced to a few journal notes and some romantic tales. Cusco, now a modern Andean town, was once the capital of the Inca Empire. It's the perfect starting point for discovering the truth about those last crucial Inca years. Archaeologist Gary Ziegler has dedicated most of his career to studying the life of the Incas and what happened to them as the Spanish grip tightened.
Well, now that you're rested up from flying in here to Cusco, I'd like to show you what we have planned out logistically for this.
This year he's joined in Cusco by British explorer Hugh Thompson.
We'll be following the railroad.
And how the horses going
to... For them, the key to learning more about the Incas lies on the ground. In the ancient ruins they feel sure are still hidden beneath the dense cloud forest that blankets the area. They believe that only a fraction of Inca settlements have ever been found, and that many more lie beneath the forest cover. They're not the first to look for lost Inca cities in these mountains. In 1911, the explorer Hiram Bingham traveled to Cusco, drawn by stories of the last days of the Inca Empire. Spanish records showed that after the Incas were defeated at Cusco in 1536, the king and his court retreated into the mountains for 40 years before fighting and losing a final battle against their conquerors. But the location of that last stronghold was never recorded, and no explorer had ever found it. Bingham was fascinated by the story and set out to find the lost city. He mapped out a route through the thick forest, climbing ever upwards until at last he emerged high above a valley and found himself looking upon one of the most spectacular archaeological finds of the 20th century, Machu Picchu. There was no end to the wonders of Machu Picchu. It was a vast complex of terraced buildings with exquisitely engineered stonework, perched breathtakingly upon a sheer Andean peak. Full of the romance of his quest, Hiram Bingham assumed that he had found the site of the Inca's last stand. He saw Machu Picchu as the ruin of a citadel, the mountain fort where the Incas had finally met their end at the hands of the Spanish invaders. But not everyone agreed. In the years following Bingham's discovery, archaeologists found no sign of military activity at Machu Picchu. It clearly wasn't a stronghold. But why had the Incas built such a lavish city in such a remote spot?
There are a lot of theories about what Machu Picchu was for. A lot of people like to think it was religious because when they look at it, they feel religious or spiritual themselves. And of course, Machu Picchu definitely has a spiritual side and a sacred center to it. But it also has a very secular side. It's very much a place where the Inca emperor could have retreated with his court during the winter months when it was very cold in Cusco, the Inca capital. If one looks at the Inca architecture around Machu Picchu, the thing that strikes me is that an enormous amount of it is residential, and very high-class residential. We're talking here about an emperor who built very high-grade buildings for his court out of the finest granite, and that's part of the charm of Machu Picchu, is the sheer quality of the finish. If you look at the plaza, one can imagine that thronged with people from all over the Inca Empire who've come here to be close to the emperor during his retreat during the winter months from Cusco.
But if Machu Picchu was a winter palace for the king and his guests, how was it supported and serviced? There's no sign of the working quarters you would expect. Gary and Hugh believe that there must have been another site nearby where the Machu Picchu workforce lived and farmed, another Inca city that no one has yet discovered. There's a clue in the writings of Hiram Bingham. He mentions that when he returned to the area in 1912, he came across traces of other ruins. He named them Yactapata, High Town, in Quechua, the language of the Inca. Since then, others have tried to find Yactapata, but all have failed. Now Gary and Hugh are determined to find those ruins. The team goes over Hiram Bingham's original notebooks from 1912. The trouble is that Bingham didn't consider these ruins to be important, so his records were distinctly casual.
We want to get over this side and the other side, and we want to try and locate Bingham's original Yactapata.
His compass bearings put him in one place. His description says he's on a ridge. In fact, he crossed over onto the Santa Teresa side of that ridge for much of that walk and then came back over to Palcai.
And so he must have hit these high passes up here that...
Bingham's journal proves frustratingly inaccurate. It's impossible to make his route fit with their modern maps.
You can't get that wrong.
Look at the difference in compass bearing. I mean, it's just like, it's unbelievable. 30 to 40 degrees wrong. How could he have made that error?
I mean, Hiram Bingham made mistakes. Hiram Bingham thought that Machu Picchu was the original city of the Incas.
But this is no brainer.
He thought it was the last city of the Incas
This
as well.
is just pointing a compass.
Hey, people get that wrong.
Yeah,
hey, that's
right.
Clearly, Bingham's notes will not be much help. And searching for ruins in this sort of terrain is like looking for a needle in a haystack. Fortunately, Hugh and Gary have modern technology to rely on instead. They're going to do their own survey from the air.
Abuelitos, are you ready?
Listo, vámonos. Ándale, muchacho.
From above, the forest cover looks just as impenetrable as it did on the ground. But the team have a vital new weapon in their armory, an infrared camera. The camera's a valuable tool, but using it is not easy. They have to avoid the cloud and fly low to get good results. And flying low in the mountains can be a hair-raising experience.
We're heading straight for the mountains here. I know. Right?
It's uncomfortable and dangerous, but it's the team's one chance, and they're determined to get results.
We got to get down or it's useless. You can't open it for 15 minutes.
At last, they get a clear view of the areas they're interested in, and they don't give up until they've filmed it all. Back on the ground, the computer shows them the camera's eye view.
Ooh, look at that. Wow. Now that's the ridge that I really wanted to look at.
Yeah.
We should be able to see anything on that ridge.
The camera works by detecting infrared or heat radiation. Vegetation and stone absorb the sun's heat differently. Stone, even when covered with foliage, will be warmer and will appear darker on the infrared image. But what the computer doesn't reveal is whether these warm shapes are natural rocky outcrops or man-made.
We can see, you can see the hot spots, the rock on top of the ridges.
I think it's exciting technology, I must say. I think it does mean you can see stuff that would pass you by otherwise.
Certainly. Oh, look at those black spots there. Did you see those?
That's the Puramak down the bottom here.
You could see the heat from the outlier.
Outliers,
that's
the
right.
two temples.
I mean, it is useful in terms of just being able to see the ruins very, very clearly compared to just standard.
I can't wait to print this out and look at it.
Hugh and Gary are sure that warm spots on one of the ridges are not natural. So sure that they've decided to head straight for the mountains to find out.
Hey, looks like the train's off.
Okay, here we go.
It's going to be quite a journey. From Cusco, they take the train, the first step in getting themselves and all their equipment deep into the Peruvian forest.
Amazing landscape. It's the way Hiram Bingham traveled when he first came down here and discovered Machu Picchu. We're following in his route, which is incredible really in many ways. We're going back to the same sort of area he went to almost 100 years ago in 1911.
Demasiado. Too much stuff.
Hi, John.
Hi there. How's it going?
Okay. Yeah.
It's the end of the line for the train, and the team rendezvous with the expedition coordinator, John Levers.
From the bridge, we've got the mules, 17 mules, and they can take us at 700 metres altitude up to the campsite, and that's no problems at all. Because it's about 45 minutes walk to the bridge, and in two trips we can carry all the bags to the bridge. It should probably take about an hour and a half, 2 hours.
I tell you, I was in the plane and I looked up the Santa Teresa Valley, and that is one mother of a valley. That's a very long valley, and to get up there is going to take us a long time. It just goes on forever.
Once across the bridge, the team can load the equipment onto mules and continue their journey towards base camp. By the time they reach base camp, it's dark. They're already at 2,600 meters, and the altitude is adding to their exhaustion. Tomorrow will be a grueling day. The next leg of the trip will take them into virgin forest. They're going to have to hack their way through.
Get too bad.
It's a steady climb, and with every step, the team feels the increasing effects of altitude.
Neat little place that we saw from below in a direct line to Machu Picchu, and that's what we hope to find now. So we come along. I'm not sure whether we went this way or that way. Hang on a second. Looks like we went this way.
Progress is slow, and soon darkness forces the team to set up camp for a second night. Gary and Hugh decide that tomorrow they will split into two parties so that they can cover more ground. They'll keep in contact via a two-way radio.
Yeah, sure. A little short of 5 minutes here, we synchronized our watches so we talk on a half hour and they turn these off so we don't go through boxes of batteries. Everything out here we save when we're out here for several weeks. All right. Go ahead.
They're now in the area highlighted by the infrared camera, but there's no sign of any rocks. Then, suddenly, the first clues. But are these rocky outcrops, or the outer edges of the lost city of Yaktapata?
This is one of the many little groups that we're finding in this area that we hope to get on the map, with the thought that this whole mountainside was a satellite complex related to Machu Picchu, which is only 5 or 6 air miles away. Of course, but we don't know what the relationship is yet, but that's what we hope to determine. They seem to be in a straight line. So.
Convinced that the rock piles really are part of a ruined site, the team presses on. Soon they'll know for certain whether they found an Inca city or just a massive natural rock formation. Finally, there's no doubt. From the vegetation in front of them emerges what is quite definitely a large, solid wall. They're looking at stones that have lain undisturbed for more than 400 years.
Look at this building. Now, have you seen anything like it? Look at the huge window in the front, the huge window here, and the huge window behind it. Now, what we know from other sites, starting with Ollantaytambo all the way over to Choqquequirao, is that we found remnants of plaster. And it's likely that this appeared nothing like this during Inca times, that this wall was totally covered over with a plaster. And as we know, it was probably rose-colored or some kind of tan. So in essence, it looked like a Santa Fe Pueblo. Can you imagine this place? Well, Gary, looks like we got a... Wow. Now we can do a much better map of this site than we did before. I've never seen anything like that in Inca architecture. So a most unusual building. This is going to take a lot of study, a lot of thinking.
As the trees are hacked away, the shape of the city emerges. Across the valley, still shrouded in clouds, the team can see the sacred mountain and the ruins of Machu Picchu.
It certainly wasn't just a farmer's house here. And the other thing is this unusual building with all these open windows. I have never seen anything like this.
What sort of compass
Or
bearing?
200 meters in length.
What sort of compass bearing are you getting?
Well, it's probably 100 degrees.
Uh-huh. Yeah. That's significantly...
And that's how the whole site lines up.
The view one gets from here is directly of Machu Picchu. And in a way, that view helps with our idea that this is just a satellite site of Machu Picchu, a support site, which might have provided workers for the main estate at Machu Picchu, but also a useful place for people to stop on the way to and from Machu Picchu.
Already they can see that this was an important settlement. With perhaps 50 buildings covering an area of roughly 2 square kilometers, it's even larger than Hugh and Gary had imagined. Later research will date the ruins and establish when and how they were used. There is a wealth of new Inca information here to be analyzed and absorbed. For Hugh Thompson, this is only the beginning.
I think the most exciting element for me of this sort of investigation is the idea that there is still so much more still to do. Some of us like to feel there's a sort of an idea around that everything's been done, everything's been explored, everything's been discovered, everything's been explained. It's not true. There are a lot of places like here, near Machu Picchu, where there's a huge amount of further work that can and is being done.
New technology will enable archaeologists to find many more of these remote sites. And each one will add more pieces to the puzzle. What seems increasingly likely is that rather than vanishing overnight, the Inca people retreated into the forests away from their defeated cities. Finding more of these sites will at last give us a clearer picture of the Incas' final days. We know something about the overthrow of the Incas from written accounts left by their Spanish conquerors. But for the older American civilizations, whose cities lay in ruins centuries before the European arrival, we have fewer clues and deeper mysteries. 3,500 miles to the north of the Inca capital, in the New Mexico area of the United States, the relics of another remarkable civilization lie amongst one of the most breathtaking landscapes in the Americas. This is Pueblo Bonito in the Chaco Canyon, one of a series of sites built here in the Four Corners region about 2,000 years ago. These are the abandoned remains of a series of remarkable buildings, the crowning achievement of the Anasazi people, who, at the zenith of their power in the 11th century AD, dominated a territory larger than any European principality of the time. Once, this city was thronged with people. These fields, now little more than dust, were filled with swaying corn. Here the Anasazi developed a well-organized and peaceful society. They mined the local turquoise and created a unique style of pottery. Archaeologist Brian Billman has spent many years studying the culture of the Anasazi and the mystery surrounding their sudden disappearance.
For 200 years, this was the center of the Puebloan world. People came from hundreds of miles on religious pilgrimages to this structure, bearing offerings of turquoise and fancy pottery. This plaza would have been filled with people watching dancers, and then, in one generation, it was all gone.
This abandonment of Chaco is the biggest mystery in the prehistory of the American Southwest. It's challenged generations of archaeologists, but Brian has a fresh approach. He's interested in the Anasazi's environment, particularly the climate, which is his speciality. But how to investigate weather that happened 900 years ago? The Anasazi built multi-level dwellings supported by posts made from trees grown nearby. Some of these local tree trunks survive, and within their tree ring patterns, Brian has found a complete record of changing weather patterns.
What the tree ring records tell us is that there were two particularly severe droughts in this area during the Puebloan period. The first one runs from about 1150 to the 1190s, about 40 years long, and it correlates exactly with the abandonment of Chaco Canyon. There's a second drought in the late 1200s which correlates with the abandonment of much of the Four Corners area by Puebloan people.
It's hard to imagine this as the lush cornfield it once was. But the Anasazi were skilled in water management, irrigating their crops from nearby rivers. For them, water shortages were nothing new. So why had the 12th century drought at Chaco been so decisive? A contributing factor must have been the state of the soils, exhausted finally after centuries of irrigation. Together with the drought, this would have spelled hunger for Anasazi. And there was something else. After centuries of peaceful living, violence had begun to stalk Chaco Canyon. While excavating in the later parts of the site, archaeologists encountered something that was to send tremors through both the academic and the local indigenous communities. Within a family dwelling were found the bodies of 7 people, men, women and children, all of whom had had a violent end.
Their limbs had been removed, flesh had been removed from the limbs. There were cut marks on the bones at muscle attachments. And then certain elements had been placed over a fire and roasted.
Longer bones had been broken into sections small enough to go into a Puebloan cooking pot. And there was evidence that the bones had been stewed. This was more than just a brutal massacre. This was strong evidence of cannibalism. Strong evidence, but not proof. Then in the hearth of one of the houses, archaeologists found a piece of coprolite, the preserved remains of human feces. It was to prove decisive. Richard Mahler is a biochemist and professor at the University of Colorado.
What we've been able to do is say, okay, the individuals were probably violently killed. Their bones and bodies had been processed. That all suggests cannibalism, but it doesn't prove it. The question is then, we can bring the concept of cannibalism all the way up to the mouth of the individuals, but you can't prove that they truly ate it.
Mahler devised a test for a protein called myoglobin. Human myoglobin is only found naturally in heart and muscle tissue, not in the intestines or stomach. The only way that myoglobin could be found in human excrement is if human flesh had actually been eaten.
We did find myoglobin, human myoglobin, in the coprolite. We feel now that it has entered the mouth and passed through the system.
This was the final proof that there had been cannibalism at Chaco Canyon. But how did this tie in with the drought and the final abandonment of the site?
The first thing that we realized after we had excavated the site and had these results back is that the site was occupied during the big drought from 1150 to the 1190s. So the occurrence of this cannibalism correlates perfectly to probably the second worst drought in the Southwest in the last 2,000 years.
So what had happened during those last tragic months at Chaco? This was not ritualistic cannibalism. It looked like the work of aggressive invaders, perhaps driven from their own homes in a desperate search for food and water. Anasazi had been driven out of Chaco Canyon, where did they go? What happened to them?
One of the great myths of the Southwest is that the Anasazi disappeared, and of course they didn't disappear. Their descendants are all around us in places like Zuni, Hopi, Acoma, the Rio Grande Pueblos. What we see when we put all the pieces together is that the Puebloan people survived. They adapted. They went through a period of extreme stress and social chaos, and they came out of it transformed in many ways, and ultimately they survived and they thrived, continued to be prosper in the Southwest until today.
For Brian Billman, the mystery of Chaco Canyon was solved. But perhaps his environmental approach could help him throw light on some other ancient enigmas. Nearly 4,000 miles to the south of Chaco Canyon, the coastal deserts of Peru seem an unlikely setting for a major civilization. But in this eerily beautiful landscape lie the remains of a flourishing city first settled 1,800 years ago. The people who lived here were called the Moche, and these giant buildings were the centerpieces of their cultural life. Part citadel, part temple, part administrative headquarters, these were the homes of the priestly elite who dominated this society, more than 1,000 years before the time of the Inca. What captured Brian Billman's interest was the unusual environment in which they had lived. Here between the Pacific Ocean and the Andes Mountains, they had made their home in one of the driest places on Earth. There's almost no rainfall in the Moche Valley, but it does rain in the neighboring mountains. For the Moche, the small rivers running down from the Andes to the ocean were their lifeline. With them, they irrigated their crops, keeping the desert at bay. It's within their ceremonial buildings that we find the real clues to the Moche. This is Huaca de la Luna, which means platform of the moon. Its inner walls are covered with murals and paintings. Moche left no writing, but their art was among the most developed of any ancient culture. Pictures covered almost everything, carved into the fabric of their cities and molded into the day-to-day objects of their lives. It's this cornucopia of art that has given us a window into Moche life. Their pictures and sculptures are elegant, beautifully wrought, and highly realistic. But they're also one of the most violent and aggressive of any civilization. The images tell us that Moche society was controlled by a caste of priests and rulers. There are vivid scenes of war, prisoners, murder, and even human sacrifice. Excavations began to reveal that the pictures had been all too realistic.
It was here in this compound behind Huaca de la Luna that one of the key discoveries in Moche archaeology was made. For the first time, we have actual evidence of human sacrifice. At least 70 young men were sacrificed in 4 different episodes, and their bodies thrown out in this compound.
It was clear from the evidence at Huaca de la Luna that Moche society had been obsessed with ritual, violence, and death. It was such an extreme preoccupation that it prompted the question, how had it come about? Had the Moche always been so violent? Brian Billman started to investigate the Moche's history. He began to look at older sites in Serra Oreja in the mountains above Huaca de la Luna.
Cerro Reja was the capital of the Moche Valley right before the construction of Huaca de la Luna. 3 cemeteries were excavated at this site, and the remains from those tombs were considerably different from what they found at the site of Huaca de la Luna, which raised a number of questions about how society had changed and why it had changed.
Although the Moche were the direct descendants of the pre-Moche people who had lived at Cerro Oreja, there seemed to have been a radical shift in their culture. Brian's colleague, Celeste Marie Gagnon, is looking for clues among skeletons from the earlier pre-Moche site. These bones are more than 2,500 years old, but there's still a lot they can reveal.
By examining skeletal remains, we can learn information about age at death, an estimation for that, sex of the individual, some basic information about trauma, about health, disease, and diet.
The Moche bones found at Huaca de la Luna had shown signs of violence, cut marks, and obvious signs of trauma. These pre-Moche bones are very different.
Well, some of the first important differences that we see in pre-Moche remains from Moche remains is they lack the large-scale sacrifice, torture information that we find from Moche remains.
These pre-Moche people all appeared to have died from natural causes. The type pottery being found with the pre-Moche bodies is also quite different. No depictions of violence, just pastoral images of animals and plants. So the pre-Moche had shown none of the violent traits so marked in their descendants. During the early centuries of the first millennium, something had provoked a major change. Brian was convinced that climate factors could have played a part, and particularly the weather extremes caused by El Niño. Even today, the El Niño weather pattern can create havoc in this part of Peru. It causes violent storms and devastating flooding. The impact on a culture centered around riverbanks can be easily imagined. Brian reasoned that a spate of El Niño years would have had far-reaching effects on the pre-Moche people.
I was interested in the impact of El Niños on society, so we set out to reconstruct the frequency of El Niños in the past, and we were looking for geological contexts that had preserved El Niño deposits.
Brian went in search of evidence. He found it in a cross-section of ancient layers of mud and stone, a geological clock that could tell him the history of the valley and the incidence of El Niños.
What we have here is 1,500 years of El Niño activity represented in this cut called the Los Chinos cut here in the Moche Valley. And where my hand is represents high-energy flood deposits.
The layers of boulders are from floodwater coursing down the valleys in the El Niño years. The finer layers are evidence of normal years. Trapped in the layers are hundreds of shards of pottery from all stages of Moche history. These are used to date each layer of the cross-section. From these, Brian can tell exactly when El Niños occurred.
The pattern that we saw from the geological cut is that for about 700 years, there was a fairly dramatic increase in the frequency of El Niños. And this corresponds to a period of high levels of violence and warfare on the coast.
This was the crucial period, from about 400 BC to 200 AD, when the peaceful pre-Moche culture was transforming into the aggressive Moche, who viewed human sacrifice as normal. For Brian, this seems more than a coincidence. Along with other archaeologists, he believes that the stress of the El Niño years made the Moche turn towards their priests for help. They made a supreme gesture, human sacrifices to appease the gods.
And in most cases, it would appear that the human sacrifice works because most El Niños are not severe. So you have a situation where leaders know an El Niño is coming. They make a big production out of performing these public human sacrifices. And 6 months later, let's say 3 times out of 4, you don't get a severe El Niño. The magic works, the religion works.
The idea of making sacrifices to avert natural disasters is widespread in human history. But in the long run, it is usually doomed to failure. Over the centuries, El Niño continued to undermine Moche life, and no amount of human sacrifice could have kept it at bay.
Certainly one possible scenario is that if we do have an increased frequency of El Niños toward the end of Moche, people may have lost faith in their political leadership, in the ability of the priests to prevent El Niños through human sacrifice. And we may well find that it was change in climate, particularly the increased frequency of El Niño, that may have been the straw that broke the camel's back.
Brian Billman's work has shown how climate can play a central role in the collapse of a civilization. But elsewhere, there may be other factors at work and other questions to be answered. In the Petén forest of Guatemala, Central America, barely visible above the forest canopy, the tips of ancient pyramids peep through the tropical vegetation. Once, more than a millennium ago, as many as 100,000 people lived here, in the city of Tikal. Tikal's inhabitants were the Maya, an intellectual, literate and artistic people who created remarkable cities, carefully planned and built with temples, pyramids and public spaces. Irrigated farms supplied their food, reservoirs stored their water. At the height of their prosperity between 250 and 900 AD, the Mayans developed mathematics to the point that they could predict eclipses and make complex engineering calculations. In their hieroglyphic script, they recorded astronomical data, the achievements of their warriors, and lists of their priests and rulers. There was regulated trade, sport, and distinctive artwork. But around 850 AD, something happened. Over the next 100 years, Tikal, along with the other Mayan cities, seemed to be abandoned. No one knows why. There's been plenty of speculation. It could have been a sudden climate change, an internal uprising, a sudden outbreak of disease, or an invasion from outside. But hard evidence has been in short supply. In the neighboring country of Belize, a Mayan site had lain forgotten for centuries. Now it's being excavated and is turning up some unexpected information. Dr. Elizabeth Graham has spent 30 years excavating Mayan sites in Belize. Recently, she's concentrated on one in particular, Lamani. archaeologists at Lamani had an untouched site to work on. At first, what they uncovered seemed to follow the accepted theory of Mayan history. But soon, the site began to reveal something quite new.
There's lots of evidence for people living here during what's known as the Maya collapse in the 10th century, when a lot of other sites are supposed to have been abandoned.
Elizabeth and her team are trying to discover why this site did not suffer the same fate as its neighbors. Carbon dating revealed that people had lived here for 3,000 years, from 1500 BC to 1450 AD. The site had been occupied long before the Maya appeared, through the whole of the Mayan Golden Age, and considerably beyond its collapse. Collecting the evidence from ceramic fragments to human bones is a painstaking task. Examining skeletons found at the site is archaeologist Christine White. Christine is applying modern techniques to see if there is anything about these ancient Mayans that might explain why things were different at Lamani.
Well, we treat every individual as if it were a forensic case. So we would try to reconstruct what we call an osteobiography, which is really a life history of that individual.
Much can be learned from these human remains. Sex, age, diet, and state of health can all be determined.
For vitamin C deficiency, for example, we see little, sometimes fairly large, what we call hematomas, like swellings, just below the surface of the bone. You see a loosening of the teeth, a degeneration of the bony tissue that holds the teeth in place. So that's how we would detect scurvy. Vitamin D deficiency shows up largely through the curvature of weight-bearing long bones, so in the legs.
The people of Lamani showed few signs of poor diet. The bones revealed that although their diet varied over time, the population remained healthy.
The skeletal evidence has been really helpful in revealing information about diet and dietary changes through time. And so far there are indications that there are some periods when people turn to the lagoon for more fish. And it may be, for example, that living near the lagoon did help. Skeletally, there is evidence that diet has changed. There is evidence that people adjust. And some of it does suggest that living near the lagoon was helpful.
But just as archaeologists were getting used to the idea that Lamani alone of the Mayan cities had carried on undisturbed, evidence of something even more perplexing began to emerge from the site. As the other Mayan cities were being abandoned, buildings at Lamani were being destroyed and then rebuilt.
I think you can see here, we have a really good example of construction right through the collapse. We have here the well-cut stones of a classic period building. It's, in other words, existed right before the collapse.
The excavation showed that around the date of the collapse of other Mayan sites, the Maya at Lamani stopped using the old style of construction and instead started building with wood. This pattern seems to occur all over the site. In places, new wooden buildings are constructed on top of old stone ones. And it's not just the architecture that changes. There are new cultural patterns too.
We begin to get a burial style that I don't know from earlier periods. And this is people buried on their faces with the legs tied back, which at first I thought might be a burial of a sacrificial prisoner because they're depicted that way on the stone monuments, but it's far too common.
Upheaval and change at Lamani and abandonment of cities all around. All this suggests invasion. But if invaders had conquered Lamani and rebuilt the city, Why had I not done the same at Tikal and all the other abandoned sites? Then, new evidence began to emerge from the work of Linda Howie, who is dating and analyzing pottery from the site. These fragments, meticulously gathered, span the entire history of its occupation. The style of each piece is analyzed and compared.
Diversity of surface treatment. You have vessels in which a red color has been applied to the surface. Red is a very dominant color. This is an example of a vessel that had one color applied to the surface, and through its firing, they've been able to bring out these coloring effects. We also have vessels like this, in which they've applied an orange color to the surface, and then paint with black and red paint to, do particular images like jaguars and this kind of abstract image here.
These diverse and vivid designs all belong to the period before general Mayan collapse. But these examples from a later date have simpler shapes and uniform colors. They seem to have been made by completely different craftsmen. But a detailed examination of the manufacturing techniques told a different story.
What we learned when we looked closely at the pottery that we found that was made during the collapse is that the forms were really different. The forms and the colors and the way that they were decorated were very different from the pottery that turned up at most sites during the Classic period. When we looked more closely at how the pottery was made, we discovered that the fabrics were the same. It's not the same, very, very similar, which suggested that the people who were making pottery, Mr. and Mrs. Average, the production groups that were here, the ceramicists, were the same people because they went to the same resources, they mixed them in the same way, but the forms were really radically different. And that's what we find really interesting, is this dichotomy.
It looked as if the craftsmen hadn't changed after all, but seemed to be following different instructions. It's as if the people had cast off their traditional Mayan identity and put on a new one. So what could explain these developments at Lamana?
Based on the evidence so far, what I think happened is that the local population remained the same, that there were largely the same families, the same craftspeople, the same fishermen. They stayed here, they didn't move. But there was a major change in who governed them. And that is the question or the mystery. Who were those people? How did they get here? Were they local? And if they were, what made such dramatic changes?
Whatever had happened to the Maya in the 9th century AD, the people of Lamanai had been able to adapt to it, embracing new ideas, changing their way of doing things, simply staying put and surviving. But while we may have some answers for this site, we're no closer to explaining what happened in the rest of the Mayan world. Elizabeth feels that we may have been asking the wrong questions. Led astray by the romantic notion of vanishing civilizations, we may not have looked hard enough for other explanations.
I think research at Lamanai, I'd like to think, I hope, will affect the way people view the rise and fall of civilizations. Not only, let's say, at the level of the general public, but as far as archaeology is concerned as well. Because I think that the assumption that the Maya collapse has affected the way we've looked at many sites. I think for some reason we want to see the ancients as somehow having a more mysterious cycle, so that, ancient civilizations can collapse and disappear. But of course we don't. And I'd like to think that Lamanai will help to get us to look at the Maya very much as the way we've got our own civilization.
Techniques and attitudes in archaeology have changed over the last century since the first Mayan excavations. Early sites might have yielded more if modern methods had been available then. Perhaps a re-examination of them will bring new insight to the crucial change.
I'd like to think that what we've learned here will change aspects of archaeology. I think it has already, but I think there's more to come.
What Elizabeth's research and that of today's other archaeologists shows is that the civilization of the Americas didn't disappear in the dramatic sense we once believed. They changed and evolved, reacting to new pressures within and without, much as our societies do now. And realizing that the people themselves didn't vanish, they simply adapted. The civilizations of the Americas were amongst the most glittering and complex the world has ever seen. But change is a constant condition, and nothing lasts forever.